I'm Sheila Warren. Longtime listeners of this show won't be surprised to hear that I spent way too much time than is normal focusing on the recent tax proposal endorsed by the G20. A quick summary. The G20 finance ministers backed a framework for international tax reform that would, among other things, create a minimum corporate tax rate of 15%. The idea behind the agreement is to avoid a race to the bottom where countries offer low tax rates in order to attract corporations. Now, historically, this behavior has led to multinationals paying relatively low taxes, something that's increasingly become a point of scrutiny in public discourse. Despite 131 countries agreeing to this historic accord, there are some who have been outspoken in their opposition. Ireland, a country known for a tax regime that attracted the European headquarters of Apple, Google, Facebook, Twitter, Pfizer, among others, is pushing back and is one of only 9 countries that didn't sign on to the framework. Rather, the Irish government is partnering with other low-tax nations to advocate for terms that would allow for small countries to make up for the loss of tax advantages. As the country with the most high-value foreign direct investment flows, this proposal could have significant implications on the Irish economy, which has long prioritized attracting multinational corporations. In fact, foreign-owned multinationals employ almost 25% of the private sector labor force and pay 80% of the corporate tax collected in the country. This wasn't always the case. Many listeners will be at least vaguely familiar with the Irish potato famine, the period in the mid-1800s where infestation ruined crops led to the death of almost 1 million people and the mass emigration of another million people, including to the United States, where they were most often greeted with discrimination and severely limited job opportunities. In 1922, after Ireland gained independence from the United Kingdom, the country saw high tariffs, protectionist policies, and a heavily agricultural economy struggling to keep up with growth elsewhere, which again led to mass emigration. By the early 1990s, Ireland was among the poorest Western European countries. But starting in 1995, the economy boomed, with a GDP growth rate of 7.8 to 11.5% over the next 5 years. This earned the economy the title Celtic Tiger, a reference to the high growth 4 Asian tigers that experienced similar high growth in the latter half of the 20th century. And this growth was, of course, no accident. In addition to low corporate tax rates, the Irish government introduced a number of pro-business regulations. Their Industrial Development Authority offered generous incentives and support, including everything from research, development, innovation grants, to site visit support, assistance with legal, visa, recruitment, property requirements. They put a huge emphasis on training and retaining tech talent. Several initiatives, including targeted skills action plans, on-the-job training programs, and funding in highly desired skill sets, and of course, created a positive feedback loop. Talent attracted top companies, which in turn attracted top talent. Even despite the Irish financial crisis of 2008 to 2013, Dublin today is a major European financial services center with the 37.8 hectare International Services Center on one side of the river and the so-called Silicon Docks on the other. And it seems like no wonder that Ireland is now home to the top 5 software companies, 14 of the 15 top medical tech companies, 10 out of 10 of the top pharma companies, and more, creating a thriving entrepreneurial ecosystem. So, what might this new tax agreement mean for a country that's had such a deliberate strategy for attracting investment and innovation? We'll speak today to 2 individuals who are deeply familiar with Ireland and can shed light on these policies and their consequences. First, we're joined by Mike O'Sullivan, an investor and writer who was the former CIO in the International Wealth Management Division of Credit Suisse, as well as an independent member of Ireland's National Economic Social Council from 2011 to 2016. He's also the author of The Leveling, which outlines what's next in politics, economics, finance, and geopolitics in the post-globalization era. We'll then bring in Lory Kehoe, the Director of Digital Assets and Blockchain at Bank of New York Mellon and the founder of Blockchain Ireland. But first, let's welcome my co-host, Michael Casey. Hey, Michael.
Hello, Sheila. Good to see you.
Hey, good to see you. I mean, what a week and weekend it's been yet again. We say that every week, but it never ceases to be accurate.
No, I mean, just waiting for summer to like let things cool down a little bit so that I could just relax. But yeah, we at CoinDesk have been extremely busy this week. Gary Gensler in particular made that. So with his first almost coming out speech 6 months into his real administration of the SEC, finally coming out and giving a major policy speech yesterday at the Aspen Security Institute's forum.
Yeah, well, as if we needed a reminder that policy really is going to shape this ecosystem around blockchain and crypto, and we all need to be keeping a very close eye on what's happening in those spaces, and of course, where we can, trying to make sure that the policy that's made is based on accurate understandings of both the technical innovation and the opportunity, of course, as well as the challenges and risks.
Yeah, actually, one of the things that I think was important and relevant to the conversation we're going to have from Gensler's speech yesterday as well is to think about, he talked about securities laws being handled from a jurisdictional basis rather than an international one. And I think that's kind of natural. Each country has their own securities commissions and agencies. But he sort of was acknowledging that there needs to be more cooperation on the international sphere because of the regulatory arbitrage that is playing out in the crypto space. So obviously something that's completely on target with the conversation we'll be having today.
Yeah, and so that gets back to, I think, the G20's attempt to create this consistent tax policy across multiple jurisdictions. And of course, the consequences of that are potentially quite profound. So let's turn to, let's bring in Mike first. And we're going to go with Mike for Michael Sullivan and Michael for Michael Casey, just so to clarify, so we know who we're talking to. We've got a little bit of that going on today. So Mike, maybe you can walk us through how tax policy has kind of worked, and maybe start with talking to the double Irish. This was something that got a lot of attention back in the day. And I wouldn't say it's directly the reason, of course, that the G20 is going the direction that it's going with this new proposal, but certainly I think there's some relationship there. So maybe you can walk us through that history a bit.
Yeah, the reason, just to start and give you a bit of context, I'm in Cork, so the Apple plant is over there, EMC is there that way, and Pfizer is there. So just to make the point that they are not sort of brass plaque companies. They employ thousands of people here, have huge plants, but it did start to an extent with tax. You mentioned the double Irish, which was a tax loophole which made it very advantageous for U.S. companies, big tech companies and multinationals to locate in Ireland. And in a way, that was sort of the seed that got them in. I think the point I'd be quite keen to make is that low tax is just part of the recipe, the secret sauce. Lots of other things as well. We have a sort of a commercial culture that's probably very common to the States, and I think that's helped in terms of setting the range for the new tax rate. Ireland is now the only official English-speaking country in Europe. Education is good. And also, I think in the European context, for a long time, many other European countries sort of shot themselves in the foot and really failed to try to attract investment into their own countries. And Ireland did the opposite. We have a very, very good institution called the IDA, which you've rightly mentioned, and they're really good. So tax has sort of been the seed. Lots of other things have come into the recipe. Many of them have flourished. And I'm actually quite confident that Ireland can move to a higher corporate tax rate and sustain that because of all the other factors. And because there's so much now path dependence, there's just such a big presence of fintech payment companies, technology companies, medtech, etc. So it really is a sort of a hub for all this in Europe now.
I would agree with that. It certainly seems there's so much gravity to Dublin as just a financial services center and really kind of a tech entrepreneurial and innovation center. And so it's interesting that this particular movement of this G20 tax policy is something that Ireland is resisting, because it would seem that, it's not, you don't really unring the bell. Once you have all that talent in a place and you have kind of an ecosystem like that, it would seem that isn't something that is going to easily go away. But Lory, I'd love to get your thoughts on just the Irish entrepreneurial ecosystem as a general matter, and the fact that there is now not just the attraction of international talent, but also a tremendous amount of Irish talent, of homegrown, if you will, talent that is now staying in the country as opposed to emigrating, and finding that there's so much opportunity to be had. So I'd love just your comments on first, how you think the tax policy as the seed that Mike noted as kind of a hook has then led to this very thriving and vibrant ecosystem.
Yeah, look, I think those comments are spot on. What we saw, I guess, was Ireland back in the 80s make a play in terms of financial services. So the Irish Financial Services Centre, the IFSC, was created by a couple of people realizing, I guess, the proximity to London, the importance of financial services, and a way to, I guess, set up businesses here that would, I guess, complement activities in New York, right? In New York's 5 hours time zone, so it's not 8 hours or 10 hours, I guess, over to California, or as we go over to Singapore or Hong Kong. It's also, and the same time zone as London, where, an easy kind of 3 or 3.5 hour flight, from door to door to get to the city. And so that became an attractive opportunity, I think, for entities to look at Dublin. So that was really, I think, a bet that was placed. And truth be told, so back in the 80s to where we are today in 2021, and hopefully for many years to come, we're still experiencing, and me personally, by working for BNY Mellon, are experiencing the benefits of that. And we've seen it flourish. So that was kind of a very important part of the story. I think what we saw then was we saw technology companies enter the fray. So in the early 2000s, we had, I guess, Google join. And maybe that was a toe in the water. And maybe that indeed was the tax hook. But then they, I guess, they liked what they saw. They saw talent, and they saw, I guess, high productivity rates. And then with the likes of one tech company, other tech companies then started to look and say, hey, what's going on there? Should we set up there? And one followed another. And then if we flash forward again to where we are today, and exactly to your point, one side of the river we have kind of lots of global banks, the other side of the river we have lots of tech companies. That has resulted in a vibrant ecosystem and a fintech scene and a regtech scene, which is actually even stronger as a subset within the ecosystem here in Ireland, or within the fintech ecosystem. What I would really say is that I think with Google, they have put down extremely strong roots in Dublin specifically. So much so that it's rumored that they will be actually pedestrianizing a street in Dublin to facilitate the increase and sprawl of the Google campus. So I think maybe news will come out later in the year or next year on that one. But Google in Ireland, I think, is now nearly topping 9,000 people. And they are, they're what we would certainly say would be, very, top end and great jobs and very sought after jobs. Another important point, and I'll finish with this before I hog too much of the mic, but is also what we're seeing is the draw, because Google's EMEA headquarters is in Dublin. There's a requirement for multiple languages to be spoken. So what we have is, a range of sales roles, a range of support roles. So we're seeing people from, I guess, Spain, Italy, France, and Germany, and many other countries that speak lots of different languages come to Dublin because there's an opportunity to work with a LinkedIn, a Facebook, a Google, et cetera, and be part, I guess, of those companies, and get a great job and a well-paid job, and also a pretty secure job. I don't think those companies are going to be going bust anytime soon. So that in turn has been another, I guess, turn of the wheel to benefit the ecosystem, because it's not just simply, I guess, white Irish men. We're getting people from all across Europe, from lots of different backgrounds, and they've actually helped change Dublin and Ireland to be a far more cosmopolitan city and country.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna take this as a little chance to indulge a little bit here, Sheila, because so my question might take a little while, just because I have to tell a story, because as you guys can tell by my last name,
Go for it.
I too am Irish descent.
I am clearly the odd one out on today's episode.
County Clare, about 150 years ago, my family moved out to Australia. That's why my accent is what it is. But I'm part of that exiting, diaspora. I'm the product of it that was for so long the story of Ireland, right? The emigre was the story. And I'll tell you a little anecdote that I think helped reinforce to me how much that had changed, precisely because of the scenarios that Lory was just describing, and you, Mike, alluded to as well. I wrote a book, weirdly enough, about another man of Irish descent. His name is Ernesto Che Guevara.
Mm-hmm. And from Limerick, I think.
From Limerick. We definitely flew through Limerick. I wrote a book about the image of Che Guevara, the famous photo. I'm not really a communist. I was writing a book about, capitalism, really, the role of this image. And I went to a place in La Higuera where Che was killed in he He was killed there in 1967, and I was there for the 40th anniversary of his death. And this was a bizarre experience. Anyway, I had to share a taxi on the way back from La Higuera, this tiny little village, to a place called Villanueva. And this weird taxi, weirdly enough, was imported from a place where they drove on the other side of the road. And so the taxi driver was driving on the right-hand side, and I was watching the speedometers in front of me, which was just bizarre. And anyway, in the back of the seat was these two characters, and they one of them sounded like they had a Swedish accent, and one sounded like an Italian accent, but both had this Italian brogue running through it. And this Irish brogue. And I was like, what's going on? What do you guys do? And it turns out they both worked in a restaurant in Dublin. One was the chef and one was the waitress. And it's just, they've been there for so long that their accents had morphed into this Italian Irish and Swedish Irish accents. And it just occurred to me, like, as I was sitting there as an Irish Australian, and covering this Irish, this famous Irish Argentine, that something profound had changed in Ireland. And what you guys are talking about is something that's really relevant to the crypto space with regards to this. And that is, it may start with policy, but it breeds all of this sort of innovation ecosystem, which then leads to all these knock-on effects, including the immigration of people into the country, and the variety and the diversity and the ingenuity and innovation that comes out of that diversity once you've set that spark off. And it used to be that the world was distinguished by geographic features. And so big cities were built upon, harbors and places that had, Sydney, Australia is founded on the incredible harbor that they found, Jackson Harbor. And ultimately that became the defining feature of our world. But now we live in a largely digital world where differentiation across places is as much defined by policy opportunity. It's also defined by the people who are there and the innovation, the opportunity to innovate, and the drive that comes from those economies. But these things are less connected to geography and more connected to the environment that is created for these things.
Yep.
So in that world, well, I suppose it's a question for you, Mike, more than anything else, because you've been really interested in this end of globalization. Globalization, I think, sometimes is misunderstood as a bland normalization of everything, when in some respects it enabled these centers of innovation and growth to emerge and to compete with each other. Do we run the risk, if we don't allow for these sparks of differentiation around policy in this case, and that definitely applies in the crypto world, if we don't let that, do we end up with everything sort of getting back to some sort of bland middle, and we kill the idea of difference and innovation and everything that comes from that variety?
Anyway. That's a super question. So I'll try my best to answer it and to do so succinctly. So what got me interested in globalization is I wrote years ago a book called Ireland and the Global Question, because this is maybe 10, 12 years ago. Ireland was the most globalized country in the world. And it had undergone massive social, economic, political change, and it was building up all these imbalances as well. So I've kind of been attached to the whole idea since. And as a bit of context, and just to go back to what Lory said, and probably will say about entrepreneurship in Ireland. I mean, when I left school, went to university in the late 80s, early 90s, setting up your own business in Ireland was out of the question. You were crazy if you're going to try it. The macro environment wasn't friendly. Interest rates, like the States and elsewhere, were super high. So there was no culture of entrepreneurship, innovation. Ireland also was interesting. I think, unlike other small countries like Switzerland and Sweden, it didn't have any economic history. And if you look at the ratio of Irish GDP to that of Britain, it's been sort of 0.5 times since whatever 1860 right up to about 1990, then changed dramatically. Now it's much higher. But Ireland is really enjoying its first big boom, and obviously its first big bust 10 years ago, and now another, I think, more sustainable boom. As regards innovation, it's a very hard one to identify in a mechanical sense in terms of what are the ingredients. What I draw out of is that if you look at the top 10 most innovative countries, 8 or 9 are small, open, globalized countries. So Singapore, New Zealand, Norway, Sweden, Ireland, etc. And they're all quite different, but they have a similar approach in that they have a very solid basis of laws, of institutions, very good education systems. They're very alert to the fact that they're small and they're exposed to the outside world. But as you say, they kind of do let innovation just take hold in and of itself. And that's actually harder to do than people think. And I'm somewhat dismayed by the innovation policy in Europe, because in many of these areas, technology, Europe is it's well behind China and the US, and there's a big conversation about Europe's strategic need to have artificial intelligence players, its own internet companies, its own major banks, and it doesn't have any of those. And there are obvious barriers to, capital markets, language, culture, etc. And I'm very pro-European, and I want this to work out. But I think there's a huge policy misnomer in that some governments think that a very centralized and somewhat controlled approach of the state being intrinsically involved in innovation and directing it is going to work. And that's worked in some countries that are very centralized, like France, but I don't think it works on a pan-European basis. And also, I don't think that a one innovation policy for all European countries is warranted either. I think each European country should be allowed the flexibility to create a kind of an innovative ecosystem across different industries. Tax is part of that, but I think R&D, education are much bigger parts.
Okay, a similar question to you, Lory. I mean, if it seemed to be that you talked about this tax scenario being essentially the spark that led to all these other things happening. If it goes away, right? If it's removed, does the ecosystem survive? I mean, it's there now. I mean, I suppose the point is, like, how important is tax to the kind of decisions that the Googles and the Pfizers and everybody else make in this case? Even if it was the beginning of their decision.
I think it is important, but I think it's a factor, not the factor, is the way I would put it. Commenting now very much as Lory in a personal capacity, what I think is going on from an Ireland perspective when it comes to tax and negotiations that are taking place are a set of intense and detailed negotiations. I think a friend of mine and I were talking about this. It was never going to be the case that Ireland was going to simply agree to those terms immediately. What we're seeing are intense negotiation where we're understanding, I guess, what is possible, and then what is the potential, I guess, midpoint for us to agree to, knowing that, and this is an important point, where realistically, if we were to agree to a 15% tax rate quickly, what would happen is that's not to say that there wouldn't be a slide to then 17.5% in 12 or 24 or 36 months time. So we are seeing, I think, skilled politicians and negotiators trying to map out what is a likely outcome, but also looking at the next step and the step after that. As this is a very complicated scenario, and one which will play out over months and the years to come.
I think it's such a good point, particularly once you have an ecosystem of talent, innovation, and entrepreneurship. Cities are not fungible. Geography is not fungible for people. They don't necessarily substitute one city for another. They build lives, they build connections, they build networks, and clearly Dublin, Ireland in particular, Ireland more generally, but Dublin specifically, does have that infrastructure that's already been built up. So I think it's a very fair point that the tax policy certainly remains attractive for multinational companies, but it isn't necessarily the driver anymore. Now, you locate in Dublin because to the points you both have made, you're going to get access to this holistic ecosystem that's got everything from the office space to the talent to the the immigration policy, whatever else it is. It's going to enable you to basically have your company thrive. But let's kind of back up a bit for some of our listeners who don't think about tax policy as much as I do. Just again, being some normal people. So how does this kind of system really work? So Mike, you walked us through the double Irish a bit, but think about just how do multinationals get taxed? What's the basis for assessment? Where do they get taxed, in one country or another, or is it both, or how does all of that work? Maybe you can kind of outline that for us a bit.
Yeah, I mean, it's fiendishly complex, which is why tax accountants and lawyers are paid so much money. So, I mean, what many of the multinationals have done is to set up entities in one country with that's got an advantageous let's say tax system. It's often not so much the actual rate of tax, but it's the way in which you can sort of dance and maneuver around that. And what you can do is, in an accounting sense, you can transfer activity from one country to another. So Google will make sales in France, but there can be some kind of cross transfer of that activity and billing from an entity, let's say in the Isle of Man or Liechtenstein, etc. So that's which reduces the tax bill in the higher tax country, and then you pay the tax in the lower tax destination. I mean, that's a very, very simplified way of doing it. There are lots of ways of writing off different activities in the value chain, R&D, etc. To different kinds of tax breaks, so that when you get to the end tax bill, it's reduced in some cases to zero.
Yeah, and I think to your point, this is extremely complicated, but let's just pause there for one moment and I'll reframe that a little bit. So what some companies wind up doing is basically deciding where activity is happening, whether or not that activity is happening across multiple jurisdictions. They almost can assign it, this is being very simplistic, they can assign it to one particular jurisdiction or geography. They can domicile that activity within a particular jurisdiction and make the decision to do that. And so those of you who are longtime listeners, I'm a former tax mergers and acquisitions attorney, and a lot of the discussion and debate and negotiation was around the domiciling of various activities and where they sat. There's a very complicated system of treaties between countries that talk about the taxation of everything from how are employees taxed, are they double taxed in both jurisdictions or not, how is it domiciling, how can some of that work. There's agreements around this, and there's a very complex web of treaties and other kinds of agreements among countries. And part of what the G20 is trying to do is to simplify some of that, which I think is an admirable attempt, to kind of do that. In part, I think the motivation, at least as stated in some parts of the press, is to avoid some of the gaming of this system to reduce the amount of overall tax that is paid. And so I think that, as we've said on the show many, many times, tax is a driver, and it does create incentives around behavior, both consumer behavior, but also corporate level behavior, but also national behavior. And so I think it's recognizing that is, I think, critical. And that, of course, is distinct from discussions that we've had already about the follow-on consequences of being a relatively low tax jurisdiction, which are that when companies domicile certain activities in a particular place, then of course they're going to invest some degree in activities there that then lead to these over time buildup of this tremendous community that then has its own momentum and gravity, such that the tax policy is no longer, to I think Lory's previous point, the driver remains just kind of one of many factors that, if adjusted, wouldn't necessarily change the desirability of that particular location.
Yeah, and I mean, what's interesting as well there's at least two other things that are interesting. I mean, if you look at the companies, the large US multinationals who are accused of, arbitraging these tax rules, these are core pillars of the sort of the geostrategic architecture of the US. I mean, those 5 companies make up 25% of the stock market. They are the pillars of the whole venture capital innovation ecosystem in the States, and they're valued, I think, as sort of parts of America's overseas strategy. And they have I guess, as agents of globalization, they've carried American influence overseas. So it's probably is more of an American policy issue than it is an Irish one. What people miss also, I think, in the Irish sense, is that in their efforts to put in place initially a low tax regime, and in the mantra that was driving Irish politicians, because unemployment here was so high, in the 80s and 90s, was jobs. And this was seen as a way of getting investment in and creating jobs, and that eventually there would be these spillover effects, etc. But it was actually the logic was employment rather than tax at its base.
Yeah, which makes perfect sense when you think about the history that I mentioned at the top of the piece.
Yeah,
which
exactly,
is that it has not been the case historically. Thinking back, I suppose it's at this point 100 years back, but nevertheless, when you had these two massive immigration moments, there really were. It's not as if opportunities and doors were wide open, to Irish immigrants. In fact, they were relegated to less desirable jobs, which did not necessarily lead to wealth creation that could create a diaspora community that could support people, this kind of thing, right? And this is a wide variety of different emigres and diaspora communities that have a similar thing that happens to them. They move to a different country, they're relegated to very low income jobs. They maybe have trouble getting status or immigration to move to different kinds of jobs. And then that in turn affects their ability to support family back home, et cetera. And all these things create a cycle that is highly problematic. And so I absolutely, the tax policy, if anything, was a lever, because the focus was creating that opportunity within Ireland to actually create this new ecosystem and create more jobs and create job growth.
Absolutely right. If I can jump in there for a second, because it builds, I think, on points that everybody has made, which is, and you said the word there, which is diaspora. So, those opportunities when people, graduate, as Michael said, they went to London or went to New York or went to Australia or Canada, and there was nothing to come home to, or they had spent so long away that their job just simply didn't exist in Ireland. And through, I guess, Google, LinkedIn, Facebook, Stripe as well, through all these companies setting up here. And also important to note about Brexit as well. Brexit has brought opportunities to Dublin. I think depending on what you read, Dublin may be either the city that has benefited most, or certainly in the top three from Brexit. So there's now jobs in Ireland, front office jobs, let's say in financial services, or top end tech jobs, which are able to attract people back from New York after having spent 10 years in New York or 10 years in London. There's opportunities here now that simply weren't there before, or jobs that pay equivalent rates to what people were accustomed to being paid in New York or London, as the case may be. And that brings talent, obviously back to Ireland in the first instance, but then other people see, they've gone there, should I think about going home? And it has that kind of network effect to bring more and more people. And look, the same for everybody all over the world. The pull and draw back home is, I guess, the older you get, the stronger it gets. I've actually unsuccessfully managed to leave Ireland, I guess, 2 or 3 times with my job. And for one reason or another, I've just gotten sucked back in. And look, very happily so. I don't want to say it's a bad place by any means. But I really think I've seen this, I guess, through friends of mine who've brought front office prime services desks from London to Dublin in order to get home. And they just said, right, my job doesn't exist. I got to figure out a way to actually create that job in Ireland. And it took them 5 years, but they did it. And then because one bank did it, then the rival bank said, hold on, should we be doing that? And then they're now looking at it, and so on. So this diaspora piece, I think, is something that Ireland plays, not overtly, but quite subtly, but it's this homing pigeon device.
It's so fascinating. And you see this happening, all over the world, right? We had an episode previously of the show about the Nigerian fintech ecosystem and this similar kind of phenomenon where you had a lot of Nigerians, who were maybe going abroad, maybe for education or whatnot, and coming back, and it created this extraordinarily vibrant fintech ecosystem within Lagos, but also within Nigeria more generally. And it's a similar phenomenon to what you're both describing. And I think that when you observe this at a global level, and you think about the implications and how some of these global policies are actually either facilitating or impeding this ability to create economic opportunity within one's home country, the country that one feels called, perhaps to go back to and support. It's very powerful. It's a very powerful thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the points that keeps coming to me. You know, we in this crypto blockchain space, you know, the mantra of decentralization is one that, you know, you start off when you get into this space. Then you start to think about it in all these different ways, like the world. What we talk about when we mean centralized architecture or decentralized architecture? And just to give you one example of where you don't think about this typically, you know, the U.S. electoral college system is a decentralized system that on the surface just seems nuts, and in some respects it's been very problematic in how it, you know, it has biased certain groups' power over others. But on the other hand, you start to see how in different ways this strange way that the US political system has a very strong center, but also these strong states, means that you get this variety in terms of policies, in terms of environments, and sort of you never get the sort of homogenization of bureaucracy across the entire thing. There are opportunities to do blockchain in Texas, but there aren't in, you know, California, for example, right? And so, you know, Silicon Valley is now losing out to Austin, but that's part of this, you know, the dynamism that is created in the US. Now, you look at Europe, and, you know, the problem that Europe wanted to face, the Eurozone, was we have too much difference in a way because we're always fighting with each other. So let's create some commonality and create a common, you know, currency that's going to create efficiencies and everything else, you know. And I think, I don't know if the jury's out or not, but it does seem as if it's certainly entrenched, and it certainly has had its payoffs. But, you know, you guys were talking about, you know, Mike, you talked about your problems with some of Europe's policies, and then Lory, you mentioned Brexit as potentially something that's creating opportunities here, because Brexit is a push away from that homogenization back to some sort of at least level of decentralization within the European frame. So what does this all mean for Ireland in terms of not just tax, but its geopolitical opportunities? I mean, how do you play these two big powers, and how do you try to sustain the dynamic innovation framework that you both described? Mike, to you.
Okay. So Ireland was recently, it was either on the cover or an inside article in The Economist. It was called Europe's or the world's sort of diplomatic kind of micropower or something, which worries me, because whenever something makes the cover of The Economist, it kind of goes the other way. But having said that, I think one thing we in Ireland underestimate is the ability of our diplomats, and I personally think they did a brilliant job during of Brexit. I mean, it's a process where there were very few winners, but I think Ireland did very well, and as a result of that process, it became politically much closer to Europe. Culturally, we're still, and we kind of fool ourselves that we can be a bit American, we can be a bit, you know, close to the Brits, we can be European. But for me, politically, it shifted Ireland firmly into the European camp, where I think we still have an advantage, because particularly with the Biden, not just the president himself, but the people around him, that there are many Irish Americans. So we kind of have a foot in the firmly in Europe, with very strong ties to the States, and again that's been important in all of these debates over tax. So I think what Ireland has to do now is maybe sort of two or three things. I think culturally it has to follow where it's gone politically. Young people in Ireland need to speak European languages, and maybe do so in a kind of a more fun way, spend more time in Europe. I think Ireland, in terms of its stock of power as a small country, it should pick maybe two or three things on the European stage where it can lead and contribute. And one of those, I think, is in the area we're talking about, you know, the future of money, the future of capital markets in Europe. That's a stalled project. And there's all this grand talk at the same time about, you know, digital identity, digital central bank currency coming from the ECB. But there's loads of groundwork needs to be done. So I would love to see Ireland take the lead in that, and be sort of the pioneer, and really drive that project. And then the third thing, where I think Ireland has got something to teach the rest of Europe. So, you know, my kind of a adopted country, or my second country, sorry, France, you know, growth this year will be 2%. In the year ahead in Ireland, it's going to be 15%. And Ireland has a lot to teach other European countries about growth. And that's the thing that worries me about Europe is not the euro, but that there's no growth mentality across European political leaders, and there is in Ireland, and you can see the fruits of it.
I imagine that gives you some leverage as well. Like you said, you've shifted towards Europe, but at the same time, this success in Brexit gives you some leverage, which I suppose means
credibility.
You can actually sort of like differentiate a little bit around tax policy. Since you're a banker, Lory, we just talked about digital currencies there. Came up. Mike referenced that. I mean, any thoughts on how these new technologies, right? It's one that's close to our heart. What our podcast is mostly about is these new technologies of money. How does that impact the way that countries are going to be able to arbitrage or not, and also multinationals arbitrage or not their tax decisions? Because money itself is going to become more fluid. At least that's what we believe.
Yeah, and I think what I would say is that all of these concepts are being closely examined. So I'm fortunate to work for a global bank where we have teams of people, I guess, in pockets all around the world, understanding and keeping a close eye on, let's say, all these central bank digital currencies. What do they mean? How far along the journey are they? And from a bank perspective, what do they mean for us? What do they mean for our clients? What are the opportunities associated with them, and what are the challenges? So my view on this is that I think, I guess looking at the digital euro for a moment, and I think it's a case of when, not if. But in terms of time frame, I think it came out a couple of weeks ago that if a digital euro was to proceed past the research stage, build would begin in 2026. So I guess in a past life working as a management consultant, I guess building a system of that nature across 27 countries will not happen quickly. So that's really going to be the back end of the decade, maybe even into the next decade. So if we're looking at that, we're a little past halfway through 2021. I definitely call that long term, and especially in blockchain and crypto and DLT land, which we live. That feels like a very long time away, right? As you guys said at the top of the show, a week is a long time in the world in which we live, let alone a decade. So, I think these things are going to happen, but it will be slow. And I think our governments and the policymakers have their respective foot on the gas or accelerator pedal, and they'll be the people that determine exactly how this plays out and when it plays out. And it's, I guess, our job to, I guess, just stay really close. And to try and also not just understand the policy pieces, but also the technical considerations. Like, for example, what are the token types? Is it going to be something akin to an NFT, an ERC 721? Is it going to be a brand new token standard? And then I think what's important for I guess all the tech ecosystem to understand is to ensure that they can, I guess, facilitate and custody those token types, and that their systems enable and allow for them. So that's a big part of the job as well, is just to stay close to the emerging tech side of things. One of the other things that you said there as well, Michael, in relation to the question that you put to Mike, I think, where's this going for Ireland? And I think it's really important to say that, when I saw that tax announcement, it made me take a step back and go, okay, I've been thinking about this for a while, and I think a lot of people in Ireland have anyway. So it wasn't like a bolt completely out of the blue, but it's actually an important thing, because I think, we need to move and have another string to our bow, not saying that we only have one string and that is tax, but we need to have other things that we can hang our hat on. And one of the things that I think we need to do more of, right, and I think the government is trying to do this, and through the support of the European Union, is to have more Irish businesses. So look, we mentioned Stripe and Google and so on and so on. What we need to do is to figure out well, how does Ireland create the next Google, and the next LinkedIn? How do we create that environment? And there's actually, I have to say, there's a great study by folks I'm working with, so Dr. Paul Ryan and Dr. Julio Bujuni, who are from the Trinity Business School, and they did a fantastic study looking at this in a part of Western Ireland, Galway, where they did a piece of research to assess over a period of time. So medtech companies came to Ireland. They employed people, which was great. But their question and research really was about what benefit did that have to create new indigenous, Irish businesses? And then in turn, if new businesses were created, were more businesses created from that? And so did it just continue to create this virtuous cycle of new employment, new businesses? And effectively, long story short, and spoiler alert for everybody, right? What they found within that sector, in that part of Ireland, was that it had that positive result. So American company came in, Irish business was created, and then more Irish business were created, not to compete with the likes of a giant Pfizer or a Merck or an Eli Lilly or whoever it is, but complementary businesses to fit within that ecosystem. And look, I guess I'm fortunate enough as well to be working with them to do a PhD on a similar topic in Dublin, to look at companies in this part of Ireland over in the East Coast. So looking at, I guess, the likes of Google, Facebook, and LinkedIn and so forth, to understand when they come here, do they create Irish businesses? And if the answer is that, they don't create as many as they could, then the question really is, how do we create those opportunities, or what's the gap? So what happens in Silicon Valley versus what happens in Dublin, and how do we create that gap so new businesses are being created? And I think you said it as well, Michael. You said it around that innovation piece. We need to figure out, what's happened elsewhere. How do we capture those ingredients? And I think if you look at Silicon Valley, it's about that mix between academia, that mix between corporates, that mix between government. It's not as if it's an incredibly secret sauce, but they seem to get it right, certainly more often than not. And I think what we need to do in Ireland is we need to do something similar. The second piece to my long-winded point here is also in relation to digital assets. So the thing here is that we said there was a play for financial services in the 80s. We said, there was another bet using the McKinsey strategy under uncertainty framework. Then there was another big bet in relation to, I guess, pharma, and we spoke about that. And then we had the tech companies, and that was another big bet. And now is the time for Ireland to place another big bet. And unsurprisingly, I guess, given the work that I've been doing for the last 8 years in this space, I think that is digital assets. I think we have an amazing opportunity based on the financial services ecosystem, based on the tech ecosystem, and also now the digital asset ecosystem with the likes of Coinbase, Kraken, Circle, Revolut, Gemini, Crypto.com, all these companies that are here. We are uniquely placed to actually really become a go-to location for digital assets. And this is something that, I guess I feel deeply passionate about, because I think the opportunity is there. And this is where we may need to, I guess, push things a little further when it comes to, I guess, policy. And we may need to look at, how people are getting, I guess, ensure that people have access to the right services from different parts of the ecosystem, so that companies go, Ireland is a great place when it comes to digital assets. We should certainly look at that.
I have about 1 billion follow-ups, Lory, but I'm also conscious that we're getting close to the end of our session. There's one thing I just want to raise to both of you that I do think is a bit orthogonal to what we've been talking about, which is, with the pandemic, we've seen the rise of remote workforces and increasingly global workforces and kind of work from anywhere and whatnot. How does that play into this whole scenario, right? Because here we're talking about how does any country or city or any community really kind of create gravity and create a gravity ecosystem to spur, talent and the desire of talent to kind of stay and all of that. is that eroded by the fact that now a lot of people, you really can in many cases work from anywhere? And if you're willing to kind of adjust your time zones a bit to meet those of your colleagues that might be in a very different jurisdiction, that is something we're seeing a lot of opening up to, particularly when it comes to tech. And of course, specifically when it comes to blockchain. We know that a lot of crypto, exits have happened after people have re-domiciled, if you will, to other places that have extraordinarily low personal capital gains or whatever it might be, so that they can realize some of that income without getting that tax hit. How does that play into all of this? Really, for either of you?
The thing I can say in Ireland's favor is it's a wet, but it's a fun place to live. So
I can confirm that. That's one of my favorite places to be.
So I think people may still want to be located here. I mean, as far as I can see so far, and I think we're just beginning to get a purchase on many of the sort of the new trends of the post-COVID era. This effect is a particular one within countries. So it's people actually relocating from Paris to Bordeaux, or from Berlin back down to Munich, or Dublin to Galway, that sort of thing. So people, I think in many cases, are still quite rooted. And I think there is what would be interesting is to see the extent to which companies feel a need to rebuild cultures. And I think you can do that really only when people are present and you have social infrastructure as well. And it's a very important part of Irish life. So I think that it would be a pity to see that go. I think there's a big opportunity there for governments in countries like Ireland to have a more coherent decentralization policy, because Dublin is very concentrated, and you can see that in traffic jams, property prices. So I think it's more of a within country policy challenge for many countries.
Yeah, totally agree. And I think, I guess friends of mine who are in their 20s and working for Google, as the case may be, and then friends of mine who are in their 30s and 40s, different life stages, kids come along, family, etc. So people obviously in their 20s want to be in the city, and they're attracted to Dublin because, within half an hour you can be up in the Dublin mountains overlooking the city, or you can be kite surfing, pretty quickly and easily. With a wetsuit, I will put that disclaimer. But I think,
or a lot of Guinness in your belly. That'll
also true.
Why not both?
That'll warm you up. Fine.
And then I think to Michael's point, exactly. I think what you're seeing is for folks who have families, they're going, you know what? I can now live on the west coast of Ireland. I can actually wake up in the morning and look at the Atlantic Ocean. And if needs be, I can go up and down to Dublin, once a week or once every couple of weeks. So I actually really do see that happening more and more. I think what we're seeing is the birth of, co-working hubs. So, and locally run co-working hubs. So less so the WeWorks or the Huckletrees, and more so county council or town-backed co-working hubs, and which are obviously, state and county sponsored, which then makes, I guess, the island of Ireland more attractive as a place to be, rather than just everything being in Dublin, as Michael said.
So we are running tight on time, but I just want to wrap this up with one little sort of way that ties the point I made at the very beginning to some stuff that you were talking about, Lory, and just get your response to it. And that is, you talk about digital assets being the next potential big thing that Ireland should go for. It's made all these moves strategically over time. We're seeing this in a number of different jurisdictions around the world. Like we've had Bermuda, we had the Premier of Bermuda on the show, and Bermuda is making a very deliberate decision around certain crypto policy structures. It's to create sandboxes and things deliberately for this reason. But an integral part of the policy is not just, we're going to promote this as crypto. We need to do something that differentiates us policy-wise from somewhere else, right? It's not to say you're going to be an utter rebel, but you do something. So I'm just wondering, with now this prospect sitting in front of Ireland, and the fact that, look, whether or not the diplomats are successful or not, tax harmonization around the world does seem to be coming. Is there a pivot, to use the Silicon Valley word here, for the Irish government to make away from, say, tax differentiation toward, say, some other form of fintech, crypto policy type differentiation. And, you know, in the context of that, you know, is there a concern that, just having heard Gary Gensler talk about the need for more harmony around the world, that this is in itself going to be a challenge for Ireland to map that path? You know, how does a country build a digital assets ecosystem of the kind you're alluding to and not run afoul of the United States right now?
So, I mean, I've got a few thoughts. So one country is doing it, Switzerland, and they've been very, very quick. They've been the developed country that's been the most aggressive in setting up all the regulatory sandboxes, the infrastructure, etc. They've been able to do it because I think they have a very well equipped and staffed regulatory landscape. They have a lot of banks, a deep banking culture. So it's been, in a way, it's been easy for them to do it. And they also have a location that people trust, and there are lots of inflows of money. And somewhat ironically, they have one of the most stable currencies. And normally what we see is that countries that try and adopt digital central bank currencies, or where you have a lot of Bitcoin activity, are those with weak economies and weak currencies. Ireland's quite different to Switzerland. Its domestic banking sector is not a strong one. I think the area for Ireland I think there's maybe two areas for Ireland to focus on. One is the infrastructure behind many of the new currencies. I find it, because it's a big issue for a government to try, you know, you have to be a bit like a venture capitalist in Silicon Valley and sort of stick the dart in a particular sub-sector, sub-industry. And I think if you can try and focus on broad infrastructure, you have I think you can put more resource to work in terms of human capital, and you stand less chance of being disrupted. And then the other one, which I think goes back to the previous point, is to play a really big role in the digital euro. And there's lots of plumbing and infrastructure needs to be built. Lots of rules, regulations need to be crafted. And there's no reason why Dublin or Cork shouldn't be one of the centers of activity for that than say Frankfurt.
Lory, final thoughts on this?
Yeah, look, and probably in some ways no surprises. I think the education piece is really important. And, you know, I think it's, how many years ago now? It was over 2 years ago, we developed and had the Masters in Blockchain by Dublin City University. Now nearly every university and college in the country has a module or has a course dedicated to it. So I think that's a really important piece. Number two, I think the ecosystem is here. That's the piece, right? So Circle, Gemini, Kraken, Revolut, the ones that I mentioned already, then that means other players that are looking to the space are going, well, where are Coinbase, Gemini, Revolut, Kraken? And then they go, they're in Dublin. Should we be in Dublin is the natural question. And then they do their homework and they decide whether it is the place to be. So that existing toehold or foothold that we have from those existing players is powerful. It's a draw. I think then what you have as well from the players is that you have people who have worked in those companies. So that leads on to the talent piece. So as a new entrant comes in, whether it is an Aave or a Compound or a Sushi Swap, whatever you want to look at, they're looking for people who have crypto and digital asset experience. And then you look at where is that kind of nucleus or talent pool in Europe? Well, where is Coinbase? And you're back to that piece. Well, they're in Dublin. Should we go there? And then I think also we look at, I guess, regulation. And look, it's an important piece of this puzzle, but Ireland is being, I think the term that I would say is probably being passive when it comes to regulation, but it has done some things, and it's done something quite well. One of them is that it brought out the virtual asset service provider regulation, which is if you enter into or act basically in the digital asset space, you have to apply to become what's known as a VASP. And this was actually initially, I guess, received by the overall digital asset community as, oh, here we go, this is going to be a big drawn out process. But actually, feedback that I've received over the last few weeks has been that the important thing is it provides clarity. So what was once before gray and you don't know where you stand, that piece of regulation was actually, it makes it clear, this is what you need to do, these are the steps you need to follow, and therefore they are the rules. And that has been well received. And I think that's what you'll continue to see. Obviously, this is my speculation. My belief is that you'll continue to see that from, I guess, the regulatory environment in Ireland. You're not going to see big bang approval of everything. That's not the way it's going to work. Absolutely not. But what you will see will be slow, careful, considered regulation, which will, I think, enable digital assets and enable Ireland to become, you know, a global digital asset hub.
Well, thank you both. There's definitely lessons there, Lory, what you just said. I think for many other jurisdictions around the world, how do we ensure that really regulation is a result of that careful, considered process that is considering all of the different consequences that might arise, not the least of which is, as we've seen with this kind of tax policy that led, whether through meandering or direct line, you know, to the creation of this vibrant, thriving ecosystem within the country of Ireland and within the city of Dublin itself, and whether we see regulation that perhaps, while well-intentioned in other jurisdictions, might wind up stifling innovation in a way that perhaps sends talent going to other places, maybe even to Dublin. So lots of lessons, I think, here to learn from the Irish experience and the policies that the government has put into place over the course of time. Thank you both. We go on forever, but thank you so much to our guests for educating us today. Mike O'Sullivan, Lory Kehoe, real pleasure to have you on. And of course, thanks to and of course, thanks to my co-host, Michael Casey. Join us next week for another episode of Money Reimagined.